Have you ever seen the horror movie Haunting in Connecticut from 2009? Did you know that it's based on a true story? Well, that's what we're going to talk about on this next episode of Peculiar Finds for Curious Minds, and I'm Jennifer Kennedy. Spoiler warning! Spoiler warning! If you haven't seen the movie, you might not want to listen to this episode until you have, because there will be spoilers. Spoiler warning! Spoiler warning! If you haven't seen the movie, you might not want to listen to this episode until you have, because there will be spoilers. The Haunting in Connecticut was a horror movie from 2009 and one of the first in the series of horror movies based on Ed and Lorraine Warren cases. In the movie, a family had a son with cancer, and they rented and moved into a house closer to his doctors to make his cancer treatment easier. In the movie, the house used to be a mortuary, and of course it turned out that the house was haunted. So what's the true story behind this movie? Well, the family of Carmen Snedeker is the family that the movie is based on. The family moved into the house on June 30th, 1986. The address is 208 Meriden Avenue. It's either Meriden or Meriden. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. So Meriden Avenue in Southington, Connecticut. It's described to be a very large and airy house. They moved into it because the rent was cheap. So that part is actually portrayed in the movie, and that part is true to the story. The house itself was a funeral home in the 1920s. It was called the Hallahan Funeral Home, and it stayed a funeral home for multiple decades. Carmen claims that she was never told of the mortuary history of the house, but one of the neighbors claims that she was informed fully of the history of the house. Carmen says that she never went into the basement because when she went to look at the house before she rented it, that there was a bunch of renovation and building material blocking the stairwell, so she was not able to check the basement out. When they moved in, they moved all the materials blocking the stairwell, and that's when they were able to go into the basement and discovered the embalming equipment. They also discovered a small graveyard back behind the house. And as they were going through the house, they found drawers full of corpse photos, toe tags, head tags, and personal belongings of the deceased, just like they portrayed in the movie. Granted, in the movie, the way they portrayed them finding the stuff is a little different than how it happened in real life, but they did indeed find these things. Now, as I said before, this is actually one of Ed and Lorraine Warren's cases, and there's some controversy about this case, about this haunting. Of course, there's always been controversy surrounding Ed and Lorraine Warren's cases. A lot of their cases have been often challenged as being false or hoaxes, and this case is also one of those. The Warrens claimed that the mortician who ran the mortuary practiced necromancy and necrophilia, and that caused demonic activity that could only be cured by an exorcism. But skeptics wrote this off as a hoax. According to skeptical investigator Benjamin Rafford, there is, quote, little or no proof that anything supernatural occurred in the house. He wrote that the author of the actual Haunting in Connecticut story, Ray Garton, was employed by the Warrens to write the supposed true story, and he claims that he was instructed by Ed Warren to fake the story. Supposedly, Ed told him, quote, you've got some of the story, just use what works and make the rest up. Just make it up and make it scary. The author of the book claims that Ed Warren told him, and I quote, he told me not to worry, that the family was crazy. I was shocked. He said, "All the people who come to us are crazy. You think sane people would come to us?" He knew I'd written a lot of horror novels prior to that, so he told me to just make the story up using whatever details I could incorporate into the book and make it scary. So that's just another example of the author giving another quote and explanation that Ed was telling him to make the story up. And then there's another person, researcher Joe Nickel, who has also dismissed the story as a hoax. Nickel has noted that since Ed Warren died in 2006, some of his co-authors have admitted that Warren, quote, told them to make up incidents and details to create scary stories. And they've all repeated these quotes in multiple interviews that they've done about the story. They all claim that Ed Warren told them to fake the incidents. But the family and the Warrens claim that it was not a hoax, that it was true. So I'll just tell you the claims of the family and the Warrens, and you can decide for yourself if you feel like this is a true story or exaggerated, which is also one of the other claims, that it's exaggerated, or if it's a complete hoax. It began the night that they moved in. Their oldest son, Philip, was 13 years old, and he did indeed have cancer, just like in the movie. He had Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a cancer of the immune system. And they did live there for 2 years to be closer to his treatment, just like in the movie. He was being treated at the UCONN hospital. It was her and her husband at the time, and her 4 kids and 2 nieces that moved into the home. The haunting began the night that they moved in, when Philip saw a tall, thin man with black hair down to his hips and black eyes. Now, they claimed that this man with the long black hair would talk to Philip every single day. Sometimes he would just say his name. Sometimes he would threaten him, but he would talk to him every day. Philip and his brother Bradley shared a room as their bedroom in the basement. The rooms up in the main part of the house were too small for the teenage boys, so they decided to put them in the basement because it had plenty of room for the both of them. So their room was in the basement in the casket display room area, which was down the hall from the former embalming room. So back to the man with the long black hair. Philip kept saying that he was seeing this man and that this man was talking to him. So his mom, Carmen, thought that maybe it was his cancer meds causing him to hallucinate. So she took him to a psychologist, but of course that didn't help. They claimed that while living in the house, Philip's personality changed, that he became distant and, quote, darker and darker, that he became mean and even violent. He would play cruel jokes on family members. Like one time he locked his brother in a chest, didn't let him out. Sometimes he wouldn't even remember the things that he did. The whole family claims that they regularly experienced a malevolent force that took different forms, showed itself as different spirits, and that they were slapped and groped repeatedly. Now, some of these things are actually shown in the movie. Some of them are exaggerated a little in the movie. There was one incident in the movie where when Carmen, the mom, was mopping the basement floor, that the water turned blood red. And this, according to the family's claims, actually happened. Carmen claimed that she was afraid she was going to mess the floor up if she continued to mop. She said that it really freaked her out to see the water turn blood red. Now, one of the things that was in the movie that's not accurate, there was a character named Jonah in the movie, and Jonah held seances. But Jonah was a fictional character. Nobody ever held any seances in the house. Jonah was basically added in order to help provide an explanation in the movie for the paranormal activity. Some of the other things that would happen, according to the family's claims, in the home, they would hear regular knocking on the walls in sets of 3, which is typically recognized as demonic because they're mocking the Holy Trinity. They would regularly hear a deep, gravelly voice. One of the more disturbing things that they claim was that mattresses would pulsate, like they were appearing like they were breathing, like the mattresses were breathing. They experienced a lot of temperature changes, both hot and cold, in most of the rooms in the home. They saw multiple spirits of people, and this is what they feel like it was something possibly demonic, and that it was showing itself as different forms and different spirits. But at the same time, they also feel like there was multiple spirits in the home because it was a mortuary. Another unusual incident that was actually portrayed in the movie was the dishes putting themselves away. After Carmen set the table, she claims that the dishes actually wound up right back in the cabinet, and she thought she was going crazy. But that was portrayed in the movie, and she claims that that actually did happen. Another one of the more bizarre incidents was the lights flickering on and off. Even when they took the light bulbs out, they would still light up and turn on and off. Now, in the movie, the father got angry and he was in a drunken stupor, and he went through the house and yanked out all the light bulbs. Now, that actually did happen. In the real life story, the father saw the electric bill and he took all the light bulbs out of the lights in the house because he thought that with the family staying up, keeping all the lights on so that they could sleep easier because they were scared from it being a haunted house, he thought that that was running the electric bill up. But he didn't do it in a drunken stupor. He was sober, and he just went through. He got upset about the electric bill, and he took all the light bulbs out. But after he did so, the lights would still come on with no bulb in them. The kids were always hearing strange voices, and random objects throughout the house would move. And they commonly heard a sound that sounded like a flock of birds taking off all at once. You know, the flapping, if you've ever heard a big group of birds taking off, the flapping of their wings was really loud. They would commonly hear this sound in the house. There's another incident in the movie where the youngest son was laying on a gurney and it spun around uncontrollably on its own. And that actually did happen, according to the family's claims. Philip didn't tell his brother what the gurney was. He just dared him to lay on it. So he did, and it started to spin all on its own, and it just kept spinning and spinning, and they couldn't get it to stop. And he says that he was really freaked out, but he had to show that he was tough to his big brother, so he stayed on the gurney. But that was portrayed in the movie, and that's one of the claims that actually happened. Another one of the entities besides the man with the long black hair that was commonly seen was a man with white hair and white eyes. And Carmen claims that when she would see him, he was in a pinstripe tuxedo and that his feet were constantly in motion, like this blurred motion that never stopped. Things got worse though. The longer they stayed in the house, things for Philip got worse. He started acting worse, his moods got worse, and one night he actually attacked one of the nieces that was living there. And that was actually portrayed in the movie. When he did it, he was taken away in an ambulance to a mental hospital for 45 days. And they portray that in the movie as well. But when he was taken to the hospital, he said to his mom, "Mom, don't leave me. It's going to come after you now." While he was in the mental hospital, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he told them about hearing the voices and seeing the ghosts and all the paranormal activity. And that's actually pretty common when you have someone who's experienced paranormal activity, seeing things and hearing voices and going into a mental hospital. It's very common that they're diagnosed with schizophrenia. So he stayed there in the hospital for 45 days. So later on down the road, they reversed the schizophrenia diagnosis. It turns out he did not have schizophrenia after all. After he came home from the mental hospital, he was still hearing the voices and seeing the spirits and experiencing all the activity. So Carmen, his mom, sent him away to live with relatives, try and see if that would help. And of course, it did. The voices immediately stopped. But later on down the road, I guess they felt like, he was better, so he returned back to the house. And as soon as he moved back in, the voices started back up again. All the ghosts, the activity, everything started right back up again. But while he was gone, when he had moved out during that time and was staying with relatives, the entity or entities that were there started focusing on Carmen's 18-year-old niece in place of him. Since he wasn't there, the niece became the target. and somewhat Carmen a little bit, depending on what interview or article you read. Some claim that Carmen was also targeted, but it was primarily the niece, Wendy. One of the more disturbing incidences, and I know I keep saying that, one of the more disturbing incidences, well, a lot of these are disturbing, but this one I think kind of tops a lot of the other ones. There was one incident where they were on the stairwell. It was Carmen and the niece, Wendy. They were on the stairwell, and Carmen's niece was just clinging to her, freaked out, scared, and she said to her, "Aunt Carmen, it's coming. Can you feel it?" I imagine she probably sounded a lot more scared than what I sounded reading her quote to you. But Carmen thought she was just kind of overreacting, freaking out a little bit too much, and she pushed her away. And when she pushed her away and she looked at her, she saw an impression of a hand moving up underneath Wendy's nightshirt. I'm not sure what they did after that. I probably would have fallen down the stairs. But seriously, that was a pretty freaky incident that they claim happened. Another incident, again, another bizarre incident. In the movie, there was a scene that portrayed Wendy being suffocated by a shower curtain. And that actually did happen, according to the claims. But instead of happening to Wendy, in the real life story, it's claimed to have happened to Carmen. She claims that the shower curtain wrapped around her face while she was in the shower and began to suffocate her, kind of like it portrayed in the movie with Wendy. She said that Wendy is the one that actually came in and had to rescue her. She couldn't fall out of the tub to try and get away from the shower curtain because she claims that there was a force pressing up against her, preventing her from falling forward or moving forward to try and escape the shower curtain that was suffocating her. That was portrayed in the movie as happening to Wendy when it actually happened to Carmen, according to the claims, and Wendy's the one that came in and rescued her. The family claims that the former workers of the funeral home were found guilty of necrophilia, but there's never been any proof found of that. Usually you can find that in court records, but there's never been any evidence to that. So we don't know if that's just hysteria from the Warrens' claims or if it's actually true or not. It's highly suspect. I mean, even in the 1920s, 1930s, there would be records of it. But no records have ever been found. Eventually, Carmen finally contacted her priest in Archdiocese and asked for help. And apparently 2 priests came to the home but were too scared to do anything, so they just left. Finally, a 3rd priest did go to the home on September 6th in 1988, and they won't name him, probably to protect his privacy, but apparently he did a 3-hour exorcism on the entire home and was able to rid the house of the entities that were there. Now, in the movie, it shows Philip finding hundreds of bodies in the walls, and all the bodies come spilling out of the walls, breaking out of the walls, and it's a pretty climatic ending to the movie, but of course that did not really happen. I think we would see that in the news all over the place if bodies started spilling out of walls. They did that as a physical representation of the spirits who were trapped there. You know, it's kind of like a metaphor. The bodies were all trapped in the walls, and when the exorcism was done and everything was wrapping up in an end, the bodies were being released from the walls where they could be free from being trapped. Well, that was to represent the spirits being released from being trapped there in the house. So it didn't physically happen, it was just a representation. One of the other things that they did in the end of the movie was burn down the house. That was their way to represent the release of the demons, which, by the way, if you truly have a demonic case or even a malevolent or negative haunting, the last thing you want to do is burn down the house. Not just because you'll get arrested for arson, but it would release these things and allow them to go to somebody else. The next door neighbor, the guy up the street. You know, you never want to burn down anything without having a priest do a proper rite. A priest or a shaman or whoever is the proper person in whatever faith you believe in needs to do the proper ceremony or ritual or rites or whatever on anything before you burn them or destroy them or anything. So in the movie, they burned down the house. It's a big finale, but that did not really happen. The house is actually still standing, and it has current residents, current owners that are living there. And they claim that there has been no paranormal activity. The landlord also claims that. The landlord claims that there's never been paranormal activity before the Snedekers lived there, and there's never been any paranormal activity since the Snedekers lived there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't paranormal activity there. There are entities, demonic, malevolent, and regular entities, but from this story, we're looking at demonic or at least malevolent, if the claims are true. They can actually attach to people and to objects, and they can follow you around. I mean, for all we know, nobody went into the basement. If all the mortuary things were still there, and there were residents there before the family went in there and moved in, then it's possible that the previous tenants never went into the basement, and that opening the basement or pulling out the corpse photos or messing with any of the mortuary equipment or any of the deceased personal items could release any kind of entities that were attached to them. It's possible that there was a demonic entity or a malevolent entity following Philip around. He had cancer. That is actually a target for demonic and malevolent entities. They target people who are sick or who have mental disabilities or mental illness because it's easier to break those people down than it is a healthier person from a malevolent and demonic entity standpoint. It's very common in cases like that to see them following someone who would have cancer, who is going through treatment that's just going to destroy their immune system to begin with. So it's very possible that something could have followed them to the house, and that maybe something else in the home or maybe spirits in the home could have enhanced it. When you're talking about demonic entities, they usually will utilize other spirits, even human ones. It's kind of like trapping them and forcing them to do their bidding. They're called familiars. And if there were spirits in this house and Philip had something demonic following him due to the cancer, I mean, you introduce that into the home and it's a perfect recipe for something really negative to happen, for the entity, the malevolent entity or a demonic entity, to gain more power and to have these spirits do the crazy haunting that the family was experiencing. That's how these sorts of things actually happen when you're talking about demonic cases or malevolent cases. So just because there was no paranormal activity before the family got there or after the family left doesn't mean that the story is necessarily completely false. I suspect that a lot of things probably did happen, that there was a lot of exaggeration once the Warrens got involved, that maybe that contributed to hysteria with the family. And working in paranormal investigations myself, I've witnessed that. You have actual hauntings, actual things happening. And when you come in and you verify it's happening, or you find evidence, or you start talking about the history, and it's very easy for the family to go into a state of hysteria. And then their minds begin to exaggerate things. They begin to exaggerate their experiences. They begin to look for paranormal in everything. Any little incident, their brain instantly deciphers it as being paranormal, when that might not necessarily be the case. And it's all induced by fear. When you come in and you verify that it is a haunting and you have evidence, or you've come up with a history, I mean, just the history alone, that for decades it was a mortuary, and then you're finding all these items, photographs of the corpses, it's easy to think that it would contribute to a state of hysteria. So I highly suspect that there probably was definitely some haunting going on, that there's probably some exaggeration. But check some things out for yourself. I mean, this is just my opinion. I feel like there's definitely some haunting here in this case, that maybe some of it was exaggerated a little due to hysteria, but I don't think it was completely a hoax. Read some articles, read some interviews, see for yourself. Do you think it's a complete hoax, or do you think it's actually true? So what about the family today? After all this happened back in the 80s, what's going on now? What happened to Philip? The family members that lived there in the house all claim to be sensitive to spirits now, ever since living there. Philip's cancer did return years later, many years later actually. He was able to lead a pretty decent life, but his cancer returned many years later, and he passed away from it on January 9th of 2012. He was 38 years old, and he had 4 kids, and he was a truck driver. That's sad that he did pass away, but after his cancer was in remission, he did get to live for a while and have kids and enjoy life before his cancer returned again. And there's nothing paranormal about his cancer returning. It just came out of remission. No entities or spirits, even when it did return. There was no kind of paranormal claims or anything like that. But the family continues to do interviews, and the movie was very successful. That is the movie A Haunting in Connecticut. If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry I gave you spoilers. Go check it out. It's a great movie. It's actually very well done for a horror movie. The movies about the Warren cases all are pretty good movies. I'll wind up doing a podcast episode for each of the movies based on the Warren cases. There's The Conjuring, The Conjuring 2, of course the Amityville Horror, and I think there's one other one that I might be leaving out. The Haunting in Connecticut 2, I'm thinking there was a second one. I'll do podcast episodes of each movie based on a Warren case, but they're not going to be one after another. They'll be mixed in with all the other episodes, so just keep listening for them. Don't forget to check out next week's episode. I'm going to be talking about an unusual dimensional topic with different dimensions and quantum physics. Something that's actually been taking place in our world today and over the past decades. Check it out next week. Don't forget. Thanks for listening.